In this video, we're going to take this rough sketch from the previous video and get to kind of like a final production that we can then export. And I want to use only Bitwig plugins. So I turned off all of the third-party stuff that I've had on here. And we're also only going to be able to pull from the anti-loops. And the point of this video really isn't to be about the anti-loops. Rather, it's going to show you kind of my process and workflow and going through this and some of the steps that I take. And maybe there'll be something useful that you can take away from this with your own productions, especially as you kind of go through this process of rough sketch to finished master. And so the first thing that we're going to do is we are going to listen to this once through and take some notes to figure out if there's some obvious things that we want to address. And there's a few different ways that you can do that. So in Bitwig, you can obviously write notes in here if you want to kind of create a checklist for yourself. You can also right-click here, make sure you show cue markers, and then you can insert cue markers that you can then give a title and a comment to. So that might be useful because it does actually also let you know the place in the track. Alternatively, depending on the type of person you are, this is what I would normally do if I was working alone, is I would just create a checklist in here that I could come back to and kind of check things off down the road. Or what you can do if you're collaborating with other people is use a tool like Asana or Trello or something like that. And you can literally just add on a bunch of like subtasks, and those will be the things that you're then going to go and check off. So those are kind of the different ways that I would go about maybe taking my notes when I listen to it for the first time. So we're going to go ahead and just listen to this once through and try to maybe take some notes as it's playing back. Okay, and obviously there was the one little issue of us looping over, but you can see I now have this list, and pretty much 90% of these tasks are just related to the arrangement itself. So we're not really even into mixing tasks at this point because this is still just kind of such a rough sketch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to work my way through this list, and then I'll obviously check back in and kind of show you the solutions I've come up with. But there's obviously 10 things that I know for sure we want to try to address here at the get-go. And then we'll likely kind of go through a similar process where we listen back and we start to think about maybe more of the mixing stuff. And the first thing I might do is, just because it's going to go faster for me, is recreate what we had here in terms of like a little bit of like a mixing chain, master bus processing, just to bring some stuff up to level that will help me out with some of my later mixing tasks. So I've taken a look at a few different things, and we're just going to kind of review these changes so that you can kind of see what's happening throughout this process. And I'm different to most music production YouTuber type people because the reality is, at least for me, things take a lot of time and a lot of trial and error and kind of fiddling to get things to sound the way you want them to. And even then, it may not be something that you use. And we'll talk about that with this transition effect that we've made. But first things first, we did create like a new master chain, and all with Bitwig stuff. So because this preset of Quick Master, I think, was made before some of the new devices, I put an EQ Plus on the front just to kind of do some more aggressive filtering there. I also did my own just sort of mono maker, and I set it to 181, not in an exact science, but when I was listening, that seemed to be the sweet spot to set it up at. And then we have this preset, which is just a mastering chain that they've created. And you can see some of the stuff that's on here already. There's a limiter, then an EQ, it goes into a compressor, and then this is a saturation module. We go into another compressor, and then you kind of have a mid-side. I don't think there's a way to turn that compressor on. It doesn't even matter, but I didn't use it. And you could just choose the volume that you want. And then a final peak limiter that I haven't really set yet. I probably will set that a little bit later on to try to come up to level. And the only thing I really messed around with were the compressor thresholds to make sure that I was getting a little bit of action on both of those. So let's turn all of this stuff off first and take a listen in a more busy section. So maybe around here-ish. I don't even know what the busiest part is. Maybe somewhere here towards the end. Yeah, let's do it here. All right. And to show you what I played with a little bit, I was making sure we were seeing a little bit of action on both of those compressors. And I didn't want to see a whole lot of action happening on this peak limiter. I want it kind of pushing right there, so it's occasionally tickling it, but at the very end, when we need to bring it up to level, we'll crank up that knob. So that's what's happened with that first task. All right, the second thing, reduce complexity of drums at the start. I did that just very straightforward. I just edited the drum track and I kind of created a new part. So we can see if we really go and zoom in here, I turned off those hi-hats and I think I added in a couple of other things. So let's take a listen to that. First, I did also add this compression or percussion loop that we'll get to in a second. And I've also been going and adjusting a lot of levels on the drum machine, and I did leave this Pro Q instance on the kick, and that's purely just because I didn't feel like going into Bitwig and redoing it, but I could just easily use the any other EQs to accomplish the same thing. That was just purely out of laziness and not wanting to have to redo it. So I did simplify the drums, and what I've done is I've kind of color-coded them into different sections. So like the one that's the most complicated is that yellow one, the medium one, and the simple one. And so a little bit of organization. I also added in this percussion loop because I felt like it was a little bit too sparse. So I don't want you to really like have it jump out, especially because we have to transition to sections without it. But here's what it sounds like on its own within the drum group. I've done some aggressive EQ. And I also added on this convolution. And then on the actual drums group, I added in light saturation and compression just to literally try to glue those two things together, just to make them feel like they exist in the same aura. And here you can really hear everything sounds super split. So that's what I've added on there on the drum bus. I don't think it's anything too exciting. It's starting with this preset called light saturation. And then the compressor, I probably didn't even touch the attack and release, and I just brought that threshold down until I started to see a little bit of wiggling happening there. So that's what I did for these drums. And then what's important is hearing this transition. And you can tell that doesn't sound too awkward. What I'm thinking about doing as well, and if I'm actually mixing for real, I tend to do like a lot of just clip automation and volume automation right when this fill comes in here. I'm thinking about just turning them down by like a few dB as well. It's going to be a subtle thing that I don't want the listener to notice, but I want to then make sure that when you get to this transition and this new part, you're not like wondering what happened to this percussion loop. All right, so the next thing was check volume of the first drum appearance. And I wrote this in because at the time when I was listening, it was almost too aggressive when the drums come in. And let's just mute this transition for right now because I don't know if we're going to need it or not. But basically what I was noticing was that first hit was really aggressive, and you can hear that I've done some stuff in that transition as well that we'll talk about. Now listening back, it's really not that big of an impact or difference, so I might even consider coming in here and turning this up even more because I do want you to feel a big slap in the face when those drums come in, but not enough to where it's distracting. So that was what I wanted to check on, and I did make some slight changes to things like volume-wise, but that really didn't require a lot of work, especially after getting the master chain stuff configured. So that's what's going on with that. Let's look at the drum and bass thing first, and then we'll come back to the transition. The transition is what I've been spending the most time on, and I still don't know if I'm going to use it or not. Okay, so basically what we did is just on this Kingfish, we've added on this EQ plus that is sidechained to the kick pre, and it's just making room for the kick, but also emphasizing kind of the I think it's like D5, which is the note. So we can listen to these guys together. And so they're not like always playing at the same time, but it's just to give it a little bit more room when the kick does hit. But I also don't want to lose the timbre of this sound at the same time. So I've included a little bit of a boost there. And after, again, running into the master bus processing, I really needed to like increase gain coming out of this thing so I could hear it. Because there were a lot of situations where it was just getting lost and I couldn't hear it at all. So just a very basic boost to try and accomplish that there. So our final thing that we've done is adding in this transition effect. And originally I was recording the video where I was making it in real time, but it was just going to take way too long. It was going to be like an hour of just going through a lot of trial and error and trying to figure stuff out. But at a top level, basically what I did was I combined two sounds that you can find within the anti-loops. There's the two rivers, which is just water, and then also the vinyl sound effect that they have. And that's down here somewhere. All right, so I fuse those two together with a ton of effects. So let's just turn those effects off first. And we're still getting a lot of reverb. I must have been on the wrong track when I just did that. Yep, apologies. So let's actually go on to the proper track and turn all these off. And we'll turn this off as well. And we'll turn that off. So here's what they just sound like together. And let me just add in these effects as we're going through so you can hear what I've been doing. So that ended up being the sound that I then bounced and put onto this transition track here. And we can hear it. And I don't remember if I had reversed this or not. Probably did. Can't remember, but basically I then reversed it and then used that as the transition. So let's go ahead and start to add some of these sounds back on, or effects. And this is just so much trial and error. And there's also a few different points where there's some automation being worked in as well. So let's just go ahead and listen to this on its own first. And we don't need to solo it. Okay, so that doesn't sound very exciting. So there's obviously a lot of effects that have been added in, and I'll just go ahead and just drop them all on. And let's listen to it now. So if you remember with what we started with to what we got with, that is a huge, huge difference. Now, in real life, typically I'm just going to drop a sample in here, like something from Loop Cloud that already fulfills the purpose, but you can always do it from scratch, and you can do it with kind of unlikely sources. As long as you coke a ton of reverb onto stuff and you record the tail, which is what I did. So when I recorded it, I bounced it out like that, and then I reversed it. And that's what allowed me to actually get that nice lead in. So this is really all just reverb tail, and this is just like the actual sound itself that came out. And then you can see that I've done a couple of just small little moves. The big one is, of course, that frequency sweep. And then it felt like it needed a little bit of auto pan, and I just used a preset for that. And then what did I actually modulate? I modulated just the amount of that, which is, determining how far that goes on the LFO. And that was how I accomplished it. And then the other thing I did that was subtle was like, I kind of knew that I need to do something in this area, not only because it's going to make room for this, but it's also going to help us with that lead in. So I added on just a couple of things. You can see this is like my whole transition effect here. One of these is just a preset that I found for like a stutter, but then I didn't want a lot of it. So I only like mixed in a little bit. And you can see that there, that's that mix. This one, not really sure what the difference is. Oh, one's the flanger. So one's the flanger amount. This one is the stutter amount. And then we have a width tool where I'm pulling the width away because this is quite a wide sound. And then we also have just another just very basic filter kind of doing the inverse. So when we listen to these together, and in fact, they're the only two things playing, it has kind of a cool effect. And I'm still not sure if I actually like this here. So this is going to be something that I'm going to have to come back to. And a big part of music production is like knowing when to say like, yeah, even though I've spent an hour or two on this, like maybe we should scrap it and start from fresh, or maybe this isn't what's needed here. So there's a lot of that decision making that happens as you're kind of going through and making this. I can definitely tell that the auto panner needs some adjusting because it's hitting so hard to the left when it's coming all the way through. So I'm probably just going to reduce the amount of that just to make it a lot more subtle. Just bring that down to like 30. We just want to barely hear it going from left to right. Yeah, I don't know. I might have to turn the auto pan off and actually just modulate like the pan manually, or not modulate it, but draw in the automation manually, because that will actually put it where it wants to go, or where I want it to go. And I haven't even really checked this on speakers. So I'm going to have to also kind of come off and check the speakers to make sure stuff is still sounding good. But that's where we're at after those like first 5 things. There's still going to be a lot more to do, but just wanted to check in so you can see some of these different things that I've done and how I've handled them. We're back and we've done a pretty wide range of things. So I'm just going to kind of go through these tasks and sort of check them off, or in some cases it's possible we didn't do anything at all because in hindsight it ends up working out okay. So the first thing that we have is this variation for first 5% appearance. And I believe the thought process at the time when I wrote that down was like, this was just kind of getting too boring and too just like repetitive over and over again. So I wanted to mix up that sound a little bit, even though it's in the background. So let's just like take a listen to it. And what we're going to hear is that I've done some EQ. I've also sidechained it, just the straight up dynamics to the Kingfish. So when we see that come in, this is going to start to dip out in volume, and that's about to happen. And the other thing we can hear, and this is sort of more of like the variation part, is this filter, which is tied to the hi-hat pre. So it's giving it just a little bit of spice there in that first section. And let's take this out of solo and listen to everything together. And I'm going to have to modify the signal on this. This is is the first time I'm listening in headphones since making these changes. So this part here, this new part, is also going to be kind of part of this in terms of adding some variation to help kind of keep this section more interesting. So that's what we did there. The next thing says variation or new part during trap light. And let's jump in and look at that. And so here is our trap light part. And we have added in some new stuff. And it is primarily this new LA Vox thing. So let's just go ahead and listen to this section. And I found this from in the anti-loops. And I really felt like this was enough to carry it through in terms of interest for the listener. And then that's the really big impact moment. And we have a final little transition to get us into our bridge type section, I guess you could call it. Kind of subtle in the background, but what I've done here is I have a little bit of automation happening with the bit crusher and then just modifying the clock frequency to give it that kind of sweepy sound. And then inside a couple of these little parts, I've done a little bit of just like pitch sliding around, again, just for kind of some interest for the listener to help them know that a transition or something is coming up. So that's the thought process there, and we can check that off. All right, need for variation in the bridge, and I sort of said automate the 5% and the guys part. And this was really because I just felt like this was way too long. And when I originally recorded it, I didn't mean for it to play out that long. So then I was kind of forced to come in here, and I've done a lot of different like automation things. And then there's still one more thing I have to do. The reality is with stuff like this, it can be a lot of trial and error. So I did a lot of like volume automation and things on this 5% part, and it sounded terrible because it's like this very ringy frequency. So instead, what I did for the first half was I added in another part that's going to happen later again in the track. So it's going to be like a little teaser. It's going to sit in the background, but it's going to help us get to that next hit in the 5%. So let's just listen from this point. Hear that thing, like, what is that? And that carries us into this part here, and then I think it's interesting enough the rest of the way through. And so the one thing I am going to do on this track is I'm going to add, and it's probably going to be a similar effect to this one, where we're going to, in sidechain, this was the 5%, this is more for the second half. This is going to be for the first half to make sure this part is coming through a little bit more and not fighting so much for space. And we might be able to be pretty aggressive with it. I do need to turn up my headphones a little bit so I can really hear the details. But very basic, simple technique inside of Bitwig that in the past would have been one of these things that would have been basically impossible to do. So I'm going to come to the Angel Vox. And what I want to do is I want to look at the spectrum on it and just kind of see where we're peaking out. So it is right around 1K. And then on the guys on that EQ, I'm going to set this, and I'll just set it with the high one too, right around like that 1K mark. It doesn't have to be exact. And then we'll go and we'll add our audio sidechain. And we're going to choose the Angel Vox. And I'm fine setting it to pre. I can really kind of hone in on that area. And this is just for the trigger. And then we're going to trigger the volume down, and we're going to be pretty aggressive with it. Okay. This might be too aggressive. We'll hear it in context. I think that's going to be pretty good. So let's listen to that. I don't want it doing too much at the front. Okay, let's listen to it without it. And then what I need to check is this happens again later in the track where it's actually louder. And so what I might have to automate is the degree that it's pushing in. So let's take a listen. Let's not solo it, so we have the reference. I think I had the wrong thing selected there, like an idiot. So we're going to have to come up into this one. Yeah, this is the one that we're supposed to be modifying. Okay. This is what gets me tripped up all the time. So I don't want to drive this in as hard because I don't want to see this moving as much. And this is typically why I prep everything in advance, because I make mistakes like this all the time. All right, so let's just have it drive in at like 6 and see what happens. I actually think that's probably still a little bit too aggressive. So we'll have it come in here around 4. All right. And again, the main reason why I have to adjust that is in this section, it is significantly louder than in this section. And I think I even have a volume automation. Yeah, this is like a whole 8 dBs louder. And I probably shouldn't go that extreme now that I've added in the other thing. So let's adjust that by about 2. And I know all this kind of looks theoretical, and it's because I've been listening to it a bunch of times that I just kind of have a feel for what I think is going to work, and I'll come back and modify it later. But to circle back to what we were going over, this was just to help us with this 5% in guys part to make it more interesting to the listener so that they're not as likely to turn it off. And I know that there's a lot of stuff here frequency-wise that's kind of clashing aggressively, but that's just like a part of this particular song. And it's genre-less, as you can tell by listening to it. So I'm totally okay with it. It kind of embraces the anti-loops theme. If anything ever jumps out too far to you as a listener, you obviously don't want to have it. But I think for me, this is like on the edge that I'm okay with. And typically with like experimental music, like I'm fine really going completely over the edge. So definitely a subjective thing there. All right, so this one I actually don't think we did anything with upon listening, this transition into the balafon part. So because there's been so much other stuff happening, it didn't really seem necessary, so we'll listen. So in hindsight, I'm good with all of that. I might slightly adjust the volume to have this be a little bit more of a fade in. I kind of tried to do that and it didn't exactly work, but I took a bunch of these parts and I tried to make it so that, you know, we're going to get like a variation between the first half of it and the second half of it. I guess the mod I didn't touch at all. Just looks like it's sitting there. Maybe I will want to play with that a little bit. Let's see. Just out of curiosity. That's actually more something that I think should go almost in the opposite direction. What's here? Yeah, that's better. That's actually what I want. Cool. And then I think I'm just going to have to do a very subtle volume fade in thing here. But basically, as I was saying, like, this needed some kind of variation, but I didn't really want to necessarily put on a whole nother part or try to do a layer because there's not a lot of instruments within the anti-loops. So let's go ahead and listen to this all in context and hear and really listen to when we get to this point how it changes. You're going to hear I introduced a slightly different part here. I think that's good. That might be a little bit too extreme, so I'll come back and tweak it. Cool, so we can get rid of those. Refine the transition effect. I'm sure you are hearing that as we're listening to it. I aggressively went in and changed it from what we were listening to before. And the reason was I just needed to try to get it to blend. So there is a ton of stuff just going on here to try to put it with the rest of the track. Like it was just too bright and sounded like it was something totally separate. So you can see that I've got a lot of other things on here. As well as some, sorry, wrong track, as well as I think a little bit of modulation on some of these parts, like to panning and things. So let's just take a listen. And trust me when I tell you, and I mean, you can probably hear it, this blends so much better than it was doing before. Definitely just feels way more connected. So I refined that. That took a long time. Some minor drum mixing. I don't even know if it's really worth showing you this, but basically with the drums, I did some different things with volume, and specifically, I believe I did mess around with the, wherever the like crash is, the cymbal. I think I went in here and did some stuff to it. I can't remember now. Let's see. Cymbal. I added a peak limiter and a transient control. And this was primarily because I wanted it to have like a longer sustain. So I'm pretty sure that's all I did with that. Nothing too exciting. We don't really need to look at that. It just was to try to make it fit better for me. So I added in the LA part. That is this that we were listening to already. I do have to modify the fade in on that because that's very loud. But it's helped work out some of these transition parts, give some variety. So that was, again, just trial and error of trying a bunch of different samples, trying to find the thing that worked, and then chopping it up a little bit. So 5% for panning in different parts. I don't think I ever really did anything with this, but basically when this gets quieter, it's like all the way over in the left and just humming out at a specific frequency. And it's more in this area, actually, here. And you can hear how that really feels like it's in the left. And I think more than anything, I adjusted panning And I might do it just specifically with this one and put this slightly to the right. But because I turned it down so far, I didn't actually have to do anything with this. Let's look and see if I ever did touch the pan here. I don't think I did. Yeah. I don't believe we ever even touched the pan. And I don't think we modulated it or anything. So we just left that alone. Might need to come and revisit that. Smooth ending. Just made sure that the final little bit of the track worked. So before, things were going on for much longer and things. And I actually really like the way it ends. It's probably my favorite part of the entire track was that little variation we did to the comping. But this is a nice smooth ending. So I just made sure I smoothed that out. So the Angel Vox, and we can listen to this. And I did a lot of really aggressive EQ and use the transient shaper and some other effects to keep this thing interesting. And the final thing I did was I created a reverb, a big reverb, like 7 seconds, and delay throw that I then compressed and EQ'd slightly just to help me get to the transition. So we'll see on the throw, that's not it. Must be this. Yeah, this is the throw that's going into the reverb at the end. So that's just there. And I did it also in this part for the little transition. So nothing fancy, but I needed to do something like that because otherwise if it just cut off, it felt way too abrupt in a style like this where everything is kind of washed out. All right, so yeah, the final thing, lead in Atmos to fill out the spectrum. This is just referring to this thing here, which was another sample. I think it was like Autumn, and I did a lot of processing to it. And it's to help this floating bounce not have to try to exist on its own when the rest of the track is so freaking dense. So we'll just play these two together. So without it and with it, it's pretty subtle. And then I did do that same sort of trick with where the main frequencies of the floating are coming through so that I can probably even turn this up a little bit more. And I put it in this section at the end as well, just to kind of fill out the frequency spectrum, more felt than heard sort of a thing. And I think on the speakers, this is making a much bigger difference than on the headphones where it really would feel like this part just did not have enough body. I can hear it there coming through a little bit, but it's not jarring. All right, so as you can tell, a lot has been done. I know that I need to adjust this. And then I don't know if I will do it or won't do it, but for those of you that really kind of want to know the process that you should follow or typically would follow, is you then want to listen to this track in mono and make any additional volume and EQ changes that you think is necessary. Listen to it back in stereo, tweak it slightly again, because again, like a lot of times you do want to still kind of sound better in stereo than mono. So if you've made some big changes in mono and then you come back to stereo and things fall apart, I would say lean towards making it sound better on stereo, but everything is ultimately a compromise. And then from there, listen to it on different sets of headphones. I have like a set of like cheaper Apple earpods that I have plugged into my interface that I could listen to this on. If you have a Bluetooth speaker, you might want to do a quick export, listen to it on a Bluetooth speaker. I don't think we're going to go through that for this track because it's not like we're really releasing this thing. And then what I'm going to do And actually, I take all of this back. I think I'm going to do it in a different order. I think what I'll probably do is get this track up to level first and then do what I just said and go mono and listen on the different sources. And the reason for that is because like we're not using a pro mixer, we're not using a pro mastering engineer, we're just doing it ourselves. It's easier for me personally to make some of these final decisions when we are at level. So I am going to bring this up. I don't know what I'm going to get it to volume wise. We'll go over that together, but essentially that's kind of the next step here. And then after I do all that, we'll come back in and talk about it a little bit, and then we'll have our final track to listen to. All right, so we are now into our final few phases here before we export the track. In real life at this point, if you have other people that you can have listen to your track, and if you want to bring in references like finalized masters, that's also a good idea. So you can do some compare and contrast to stuff like the frequency range and also to the loudness level. In our case, because this is not really genre specific and it's really just something we've been doing for fun, I'm not as concerned with those two things like referencing or handing this track off to other people to listen to. I think I can just make these final decisions and that will be good enough. But in real life, that's always a good idea because you never know what stuff other people are going to hear that you've missed, and vice versa if you're reviewing tracks for people. That's always a very interesting and eye-opening thing to do. And definitely worthwhile if you are making genre-specific, released music. In our case, that's not really what's going on here. So the first thing I did was, adjust this maximize level. And I did bring on a third-party plugin to try to kind of have a target number in mind, just for reference. And I even went over this number a little bit and it still sounded okay. So I'm fine going beyond whatever the recommended number is for these things as long as it still sounds okay. So just as an FYI, it always comes down to the ear test ultimately. Numbers and data is useful, but don't rely on that more than just your own ears and your instincts. So as we play this back through, we'll see that we are now getting some action on the peak limiter. Generally speaking, you don't want to see this going crazy. Like if you're seeing like 10 dB on the peak limiter, you've probably done something wrong in the mixing phase, and you really need to go back and check your levels and check your compression and check your limiting on a track by track basis. In a lot of cases, like even in this case, I think that if we were just trying to get to like -14 as our target, we may not really need to be doing much limiting at all, which means that we've done a pretty good job in our mixing of getting it close to the level that we wanted to. So let's just go ahead and listen to this, and we'll probably come back in and check a couple of those other things. Let's just watch to see how much action we get on the limiter as we go through the track. Kind of the only thing that I'm hearing at this point is that I could probably turn down that sort of 808 drum because that's really kicking through. And that's also kicking through a little bit too aggressively. And if we look on our like spectrum, or we look in here, like my suspicions are holding true that we've got probably too much going on in the bass ranges that we can tweak. Or if we have an EQ on here, we can also adjust that on the tone. So I just want to see that that actually goes down. Yeah, I could do a little bit of that, and I'm also just going to turn those two things down a little bit. To find the right thing, and now there's a little bit of a delay once we turn on that other stuff, which is annoying. So I'm just going to turn my kick down by like a dB or two and hope that that solves the problem. And if I have to at this point too, I could always add on a second EQ here just to try to address that low end. Let me go onto my master and also just turn off these two and deactivate them at this point so that we don't get all of that, what do you call it, latency happening. I think I'm good with that. That's what we're going to roll with, and we're just not going to look back. So if we make these changes, let's just roll with it. Let's not look back on it as we're going through. And again, let's go to a more busy section and let's just watch to see what's happening with the limiter. And again, I just want to make sure I don't see anything crazy. Like that -4 is probably about as extreme as I'm going to want to go. And we can also kind of knock out the second task, which is looking at the spectrum. And a lot of times what I'm looking at here, I'm pretty much okay with. Like, maybe we want to add a boost around 2K just a little bit, because consistently I'm seeing there's like a dip there. So let's actually go and accomplish that with our EQ as well. And to be honest, like, I'm actually not 100% sure with the spectrum that I'm looking at, because I'm used to using a different one. But let's just go to like 2K and just give it like the tiniest of bump, even if it's just by like 1 dB, just to try to kind of fill that out a little bit. Let's be a little more aggressive. Let's go 1.5 and let's just smooth this out a little bit. And I am hearing a difference to that low end for sure. Okay. Feeling pretty good about that. I'm hearing different details and stuff now that it's on headphones that I've never heard on the speakers before, which is kind of cool. There's obviously a lot of stuff going on in this track. If you listen to it 100 times, you'd probably pick out different things because of all the randomization that's going on. But we can also check off the frequency range at this point. So I'm going to check that off. Now I'm going to have to pause the video, and I am going to listen to the whole thing on my headphones. And as I'm listening on my headphones, I am going to adjust the volume mostly want to stay around what's a comfortable listening range for people. But then a lot of times you do want to check it when it's a little bit quieter, and then check it when it's really loud too, just because those are the ways people are going to listen. But ultimately, again, just like I've been saying, like at your comfortable listening range, make sure that it sounds good there. That's most important. All right, so I just finished up listening back on my headphones and changing the volume a little bit. And I really only made a couple tweaks. One was to the overall level of the drums, and I think I ended up just settling on where it was. So I played with that a few times, and I think ultimately just came to the same conclusion. They sound a little loud in the first section, but that's kind of the only way to then have them work later on in the track. Of course, I could automate the level too if I wanted to do that and turn them down a little bit in the first section, but I'm okay leaving them at that level. And my reasoning is simply that the listener is going to get a chance to hear the detail of the drum here, and then hopefully their brain maybe fills in the gap with those details when it's getting a little bit more busy here. Probably total BS, but that's my thought process. And then the other thing that I changed around was the volume of this part when it comes in. It was way too loud when it first hit. So I added in kind of a whole 7 dB of like automation there. So let's listen to it. And so even with the volume turned down that low, you still really hear what's going on. So just imagine that being like 6 dB louder. It was really jumping through. So I didn't notice that on the speakers, but I definitely just noticed that on my headphones, and I made that little tweak. Luckily, nothing else was really jumping out at me. Something I did earlier was I got rid of this other lead-in part because it just wasn't fitting. And so I just had that last little like half bar come through. And that was, again, because when that was all in there, it just did not work. So that little small change was made as well. And yeah, I mean, don't be afraid to take stuff out afterwards. I think that's also something that people sometimes are a little bit nervous or hesitant to do. And you can tell even from looking at this arrangement, I probably could have done a better job of that, of removing some stuff in some of these other sections, because there is just a lot going on. Anyway, the next thing that we're going to do is we are going to remove the headphones, play this track back in mono, and probably again go and adjust some levels of things to make sure that in mono it sounds okay. I'm not overly concerned with that here because, again, this is just a wild and crazy track where stereo means so much more than mono, but you do want to make sure if somebody is playing this out on a Bluetooth speaker or something that it doesn't sound completely horrible. So as long as it doesn't sound completely horrible, I'll probably check that off the list, but that is the next thing that we are going to do. So after listening back in mono a few times, I did make a couple of changes, again, mostly just to volume and a little bit to EQ where things were kind of standing out in a weird way. So the drums, again, were bothering me in terms of their level. So I did go in and do a little bit of automation to the volume on the drums group track. I just used the output volume on the compressor. And let's go ahead and just listen now. And this is going to sound weird to you if you're in headphones, so you really kind of got to do it on speakers, but it is what it is. So to me, it sounds a little bit better now with it turned down. I am going to go back and listen on stereo in a second. So I might be fine tuning this or trying to come to a middle ground if it sounds bad then on stereo, which to me is more important. But again, I adjusted it slightly for this next section. And then after that, they go back to full volume here. And And so I also tweaked the volume of this just a little bit. And I did a lot of really small volume tweaks just to try to make sure nothing really felt like it was out of place. So I won't be able to go through and show you all of them because I don't even remember what they all were. But I know that I came in here and did like a frequency dip. And I also know that I took the volume down even further and then have it do some kind of a jump right at the end here. That wasn't the best English in the world, but so be it. And then the other thing that I really felt like I had to do, which on stereo I never noticed, but when this part finishes, and it's part of the reason why I do this frequency shift out, it feels like something in the high end is just gone. So I ended up going on here and adding on an EQ that's only going to come on at the end here, and it just like brings up some of those frequencies that are so prevalent with this sound here. So let's take a listen to this transition. And again, in headphones, it probably sounds really funky, but on my speakers in mono, that made a really big difference. So what we're going to do now is probably end up reversing most of the stuff we just did, but I'm going to go back, listen to it on stereo, make any further tweaks that are necessary, and then listen on a pair of Apple earbuds that have a very different kind of like frequency response to what my studio headphones have. And as long as things are sounding good, we'll be ready to go ahead and export it. So I'm going to go ahead again, pause the video, check this back on stereo, make sure nothing's jumping out weird to me, and then hopefully we can wrap this up. I know this has been a long video and a lot of just sort of what feels like monotonous steps, but all these things are very important in terms of trying to get a track ready to export. And in real life too, a lot of times you want to like divvy this up over multiple days so that you're not having like major ear fatigue when you're doing this. But obviously I'm not taking my own advice because I'm going to go ahead and do this on stereo right now and then make any final little adjustments. All right, so I just completed my playback yet again on stereo, and the only thing that I really touched were the hi-hats, and it's just the one thing that's jumping out to me as kind of sounding like it just doesn't even belong with the rest of the track. And so my solution was just to turn it down and use a little bit of like transient control on them. So I think for certain mixes, like depending on the other stuff that's going on, that actually might be really effective and be really good for the listener to sometimes get that little pop of transient and hi-hat coming from a different place in the stereo field. But for this track where there's already so much going on, to me, it's just distracting. But of course, it is very much a subjective kind of choice and decision. It's not the right answer. It's not the wrong answer. It's just the answer that I've chosen. And then again, like I think most of the things we did on mono worked fine coming through to stereo, but there's never going to be that like all magical, mighty solution to the puzzle. So now when we get to this part here, for me, it might actually be a little bit too quiet now in stereo, whereas on mono, we really had to crank it and turn it down. So, I might consider just bringing this up like half a dB, but not any more than that because I know what's going to happen on mono. But otherwise, I think the other changes I liked. Now I'm back listening on headphones again, so it's almost like I've done a full 360. And the increased high end for this section definitely does work coming out of that part on stereo. It was a net positive for sure on both accounts. So happy with that. Final thing we're going to do is just listen on our Apple earbuds. Again, if something is really, really jumping out, I want to fix it. Because a lot of people are going to be listening back on headphones with a frequency curve and response that's very similar to those Apple earbuds. So that's going to be the final thing. And then we'll just come back and we'll export the track. And, I'll make sure that I upload the exported track onto YouTube so you can hear what the YouTube compression is doing. In some cases, you also could go in and kind of adjust your master chain a little bit to try to have it coming out like around that -14 so that YouTube's not going to do a bunch of normalization. But sometimes I've actually found, and again, it's just sort of trial and error, that if you really push in hard and then send it into YouTube, it actually sounds better than if you try to get that perfect number for YouTube. So there's a lot of trial and error and experimentation, but I'll definitely let you hear, what it sounds like on YouTube, as well as giving you the option to download the WAV file if you really care, if you are that nerdy and concerned with this stuff. Again, normally, if this was the sort of track that, you're getting ready to release, you really do want other people kind of taking care of these final things because you've probably just gotten way too close to the track. And, if you're like me, you're not an expert in this process. So this is me just doing my best for sure. So let's listen back on the earbuds and then we'll jump back in to close out the video. So I just finished listening up on my earpods, and the one thing that really jumped out on those was this kingfish part here. So I've compressed it a little bit to try to adjust for some of that like variation in velocity without totally killing it. And then I've just kind of reset the volume on it. So I'm going to listen back to this now and just make sure that it's okay. And my test is going to be to like mute it and then unmute it. I just want to quickly be able to listen to it at different volumes on my headphones to get a sense for that, make sure that it's working. And I think I'm happy with that. So overall, I'm good with everything with this track. So the next step is just going to be to go in here and to export it. So let me go ahead and check this off the list. And luckily here we can pretty easily get our range. And I'll just take it back a little bit. And I want to make sure, yep, we're going to grab everything. All right, so we'll start it there. And we will end it. And this I might actually listen to find the right place. So we can probably cut it off a little bit earlier. Yeah, I think right to there should be good. And maybe it does actually make sense to start it right there in this case. I don't want there to be any gap before this comes in. So in this instance, I'm going to start it right there on bar 1. I don't usually do that, but I think that's what I'm going to do in this case. And let's go ahead and export it. So we will choose wave 16-bit. That's totally fine with me. No need to go 24-bit on something like this. I guess we probably should dither it. Like usual, I'm not somebody who's like overly concerned with this stuff. Let's do, yeah, we'll do 44.1 and we'll dither it. And we want it to be that loop region. Okay, all looks good. And I'll hit OK. And after exporting, it's always a good idea to just bring stuff in and listen to it, make sure that the WAV file looks normal or the way you're expecting it to look. This is how I was expecting it to come out, so I'm happy with that. And then again, we can use like Streamliner to kind of double check to see where our LUFs are ending up. And if we really wanted to listen to hear what it might sound on YouTube, you know, we have the option to do that. But overall, I'm pretty happy with this. The 2 or 3 days later, I've come back and I've listened to this again. And this time it was after I had just been listening to some other stuff, like while I was doing other work in the background. And that's a very good indicator as a listener, you know, especially after you've gotten too close to a track. And I instantly noticed some problems that I thought I should probably adjust. Obviously, this track is kind of its own genre, so the rules or basic rules don't always apply to stuff like this when it's more experimental. But some things that were obvious to me was like the snare was just cutting through so much, but the kick wasn't. So I wanted to make sure I could have the kick kind of be hitting or seemingly hitting as hard as the snare. And I also noticed that this transition was way too quiet. And this, the first time the Angel Vox comes in, was way too loud. Like all those things just stood out to me, just listening kind of passively. And so I went in and made some changes. I'm not going to replay the track, but I will upload another video that has this version that's been exported, so you can kind of maybe hear the differences if you really want to. I don't think you're going to really want to do that, but just for the sake of kind of completion. So what I did to try to solve the kick problem, and I tried a few different things, what ultimately I thought worked the best was to mid-side split a bunch of these tracks, and you'll see that on a lot of them. I didn't do it to the crackle, but to this one I did it, and I know I did it as well to probably the Angel Vox and maybe this one. Yeah, I can see the mid-side on there and the mid-side on there. And I kind of adjusted the compressor settings to each of these parts because in some cases it didn't need to be as aggressive. For this one, it really did need to be aggressive because I think that's where the main barrier or burying of the kick was happening. So let's take a listen to some different sections and just hear if it sounds like the kick is coming through a little bit better and if the drums sound a little bit better balanced. Let's listen here. And let's come into this section where it really was making a big difference. You'll notice that I turned off the Kingfish from this part as well because it actually seemed to be hurting more than helping. Hear the Angel Vox coming in quieter. So yeah, after making all those changes, I'm a little bit happier with how the track is sounding now, and nothing's really jumping out to me in a bad way, which is really what I'm going for. So now we are officially done and have taken this track from very basic sketch to more of a finalized production, if you will. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse, but we have taken it all the way. Thank you for watching, and like always, if you have any questions, just leave them down below. Thanks.